It's not very often that an anime comes along which I would describe as awesomely bad. Whereas any moron can just scrounge together some friends, cameras, and pirated editing software to shit out a crappy live-action film, getting a full-blown animated TV series to air is no small feat. This is typically the product of dozens, if not hundreds, of professional, college-educated staff, some handpicked by producers with major corporate backing and others hired as regular employees at serious studios. Most of the time when an animated show is bad, it's for a handful of obvious reasons. Either it's just that the show is cynical and trite, built around lazily trying to cash in on the current trends of what other bigger shows have made popular, or the production was clearly rushed and badly planned, or outsourced to less talented staff, leaving a visually inconsistent product. It's very rare that something gets released which is obviously dramatically wrong in not only its writing and basic presentation, but in that it totally misunderstands the basics of cinematography. It takes a whole lot of people doing their jobs very poorly to end up with something as bad as the anime adaptation of Arifureta from Commonplace to World's Strongest. I can't even do justice to the amount of problems in this show by properly introducing the source material and its storyline. Because if you have consumed those, then you already know just how badly the first episode of the anime missed the mark. And if you haven't, then you're probably in the same boat that I was when I started watching it for the first time, not even having read a plot description before diving in. And you're about to be very, very confused. Perhaps I can at least give the show some credit for starting in a way that I've never seen an anime start before. That is, with this spinning CGI meteorite proudly displaying the names of the studios responsible for it before they are swallowed in flames, cutting directly into the show proper. Probably? It's hard to tell at first because we're actually shown a montage of translucent images overlaid onto some kind of rock? Well, I'm already lost. First of all, that studio meteor looks like it came from an N64 game. Secondly, what even is up with the fire? Aside from being a generic screen wipe, it's completely irrelevant. Nothing before or after it involves fire. Fire is not thematically relevant to the show, it's just random fire. Something you would be able to explain away with ease if this were just some screen wipe plugin on whatever editing software was used to make the show, but again, someone actually had to animate this, meaning that the thought behind it could only have been, how should we dramatically transition between the studio names and the start of the action? Fire? Fire is cool. So right away, these images superimposed on this rock are barely discernible. We have just enough time to tell that someone is running through a field of energy beams before we see him getting hit and enveloped in light, but the next couple images are needlessly confusing. It cuts to a random shot of him in an unrelated location looking tired, and then to a bunch of other people with shocked expressions as one reaches out uselessly from a distance. Now, because I've already seen the full episode, I know that this image is meant to follow directly after the main character getting hit by the energy beam, but my first time through, I had just assumed that this was a collage of random moments from throughout this guy's adventure, because of the way that what is assumably an unrelated shot from earlier in the journey is placed in between the shots that are actually related. Considering that this image doesn't communicate any information whatsoever, I can't say I understand why it's there. As the transparent images fade, we can finally tell what the hell they were being projected over. A cave ceiling. You would naturally then expect the camera to pan down, revealing that someone is staring up at this ceiling and recalling all of those images. But nope, it just fades to black. The funny thing about this moment is that it actually does play smartly on our expectations as viewers to some extent. I mean, it says a lot that I was able to correctly guess that these were someone's delirious memories playing out as they woke up in some dark cave, except that by failing to follow through on the actual reveal of said circumstance, it calls that assumption into question. Suddenly, I'm not actually sure what the fuck is going on, because my expectation was subverted, and everything I've seen so far has been such a jumbled mess that I don't know what to think. Next, we're plunged into a bubble void as the character fades into the darkness. Obviously, this is a metaphor, but for what? Is he dying? Going unconscious? Or is this actually literal? We've seen energy beams and people in generic armor, so it's safe to assume this is a fantasy world. Is this magic? Is he going through a dimensional rift? It's in a case like this where generic imagery becomes a double-edged sword. The roof of the cave was pretty unambiguous, but bubble voids have been used for so many different aesthetic purposes that I need clarification before I can make any reasonable assumptions. After that, a spotlight dances over some blonde girl's body. We can tell from the position of her arms that she's probably chained up or something, but otherwise all this image wants to tell us is that there will eventually be a cute blonde waifu in this show. This is followed by a guy kneeling in a void, except his body is clearly drawn as though he were being lit by something, so it looks weird. And then he stands up and we see that he's in some kind of starry forest, but the void closes in and swallows him. I can only interpret this as some kind of an attempt to be artsy. Was this supposed to look badass? Why the hell is the character drawn so tiny? From there, we're launched into one of the most bafflingly weird opening title sequences I've ever seen. The name of the show is flying towards the camera as just plain black text on a plain white background, and the main dude is beating the shit out of the letters. Meanwhile, emaciated waifu girl is crucified on a kanji, and then one of them swallows the screen, and we get a couple of framing gimmicks before this idea is dropped completely in favor of an entrance by way of CGI rose petals. Before I blow past this though, I want to talk about framing some more. One of the very first things that you'll learn in any photography class is the rule of thirds. It's a very simple idea. The most aesthetically pleasing images are ones which focus their subject matter around a third of the way into the frame on either side. Directly centered images tend to read as flat and are best used in film as punctuation. They can bring home big emotions with how directly they confront the audience, or even feel unsettling for the same reason. Most of the time though, framing shots is organized under some conception of the thirds principle. Moreover, in order for the subject matter to have a strong presence in the frame, they need to take up a considerable amount of it, unless the point of the framing is to use them as a grounding while drawing your attention away from them into the background. If something is too small, it reads as unimportant or just not impactful. I bring all of this up because in the last 30 seconds we've seen two shots which break these principles to jarring effect, and not in a good or purposeful way. Rather than even trying to explain what's wrong, since these just have blank black backgrounds anyways, I can just crop them and show you how much better they would look with even the slightest tweaking. I have no idea how professionals could fuck this up. So this next part of the OP is actually kind of a neat idea. We flow down this woman's kimono onto an animated version of its graphic. Lots of cool OPs find ways for the images to flow naturally into one another, and you'd probably imagine the camera panning right as the abstract river and clouds fade into literal ones before arriving at some main character staring hand over his eyes at the sun over the river. But nope, it's just another random fire transition, and then a landscape shot of somewhere. Total waste. Now I know we're 1500 words into this mess, and so far all we've seen were incomprehensible flashes of random characters, bizarre metaphors, and attempts to be artsy, but this next moment in the OP is actually crucially important to understanding what the fuck this show even actually is. If you, like me, are so distracted by the fact that this is clearly a still image which the camera pans back on while only the cheap-looking graphical effect is animated over top of it, you might not even take in what's actually going on here, and thus miss the only backstory that is ever presented in this first episode. Of course, we have no context into who any of these people are or what the fuck is happening here, whether this was the result of these kids casting some kind of magic spell gone awry, or a freak random occurrence, or even something that would be normally possible in this show's version of Earth. But we do glean one extremely crucial piece of information. These people are Japanese high school students. If you don't pick up on this fact in these 2 seconds of the OP, you will have no reason to assume going into the series that this is in fact an isekai anime. Continuing along, we pass through an inverted colors Phantasy Star Online loading screen before emerging onto... is this a wall, a staircase, the outer perimeter of a town? It's going up a mountain? Oh, well, now it's a battle against some of the shittiest monster designs ever. Okay, we can skip the rest of the OP. So the episode finally properly begins with Light Novel Guy waking up in the middle of a cave, and everything is way the hell too goddamn dark. It might not have been so bad if the main character's outfit contrasted with the background colors at all, but everything looks muddy and bad and hard to see. Now I'm sure some of you are thinking, well no shit, it's dark. The whole point of the scene is that it's set in a pitch black cave. Well, dear viewer, one of the delightful things about art is that you can use abstraction to convey the sense of something being a certain way without having to literally make it that way. Take, for instance, the exact same scenario as it occurs in Slime Isekai. We are made to understand the main character's inability to see and the pitch blackness of the cave through both the dialogue and visual cues, but then the cave is presented in a way that allows us to see it, while understanding that it is not literally as bright as what we are seeing. In real life, we will almost never be put into a situation wherein we can actually see in a place which would be colored entirely in cool blues, which makes us feel like we're seeing a dark place even though it isn't literally dark. Consider also the possibility of discoloring everything in a way which is even more obviously non-literal, so that it's explicitly clear that the presentation is being warped to allow us non-diegetic visibility. Or even cool effects like this one from Yu Yu Hakusho, where harsh light is applied to the silhouettes of characters even though most of the screen is black, leading to high visibility in what is clearly meant to be a very dark scene. Now can you appreciate how the most aesthetically inelegant way to convey that a scene is set in the dark is to make it literally as dark, muddy, and visually unappealing as possible? So our boy fumbles around in the darkness for a while until he stumbles on a stupid-looking bunny. He muses on how at this level of the dungeon the enemies should be much stronger, so at least we have a sense now that this is some kind of RPG video game world, unsurprisingly. And then we cut to wolves. If you watch a lot of YouTube analysis videos, you've probably heard people talk about the Kuleshov effect, which is one of the most basic principles of filmmaking. Essentially, it refers to how our brains will automatically make the assumption that images displayed in sequence are meant to relate to one another. If a character is looking at something off-screen, then we will assume that whatever the camera cuts to next is the thing they were looking at. Obviously, we just witnessed this when the guy was looking at the rabbit, but the shot before the wolves appear manages to muddy the issue by having the guy look around in two different locations before the cut. This would imply that he isn't sure where the sound he's hearing is coming from, and is glancing around to try to find it. As such, when the next shot just cuts to the wolves somewhere else, we have no idea where they are in relationship to the protagonist, until we see them interact with the rabbit. If you watch this scene more than once, it makes perfect sense, because you already understand that the wolves are coming in from the side to attack the rabbit. But the first time you see this shot of the wolves, your brain has to scramble to decide where to place them in relationship to the protagonist. After all, we don't know our surroundings. This is not a real place with real dimensions in the way that an actual 3D room in an RPG is. Moreover, the last place that the main character looked was to his left, and yet going by the composition of this shot, it would seem like they were coming in from the right, which apparently they are. But until we know that, flipping from a character looking left to wolves coming in from the right leaves us with no idea what the fuck the spatial relationship between all of these elements is. Now granted, this is resolved pretty quickly in the very next shot when the wolves attack the bunny, which we at least know was directly in front of the main character as was unambiguously shown in prior shots. However, by the time we get to this shot, our train of thought has already been diverted. It feels as though the flow of the scene has been disrupted, and we're no longer associating each image in the sequence as relating to one another directly. This is what makes most of the action in Arifureta feel like a confusing, jumbled mess that only makes sense in retrospect. The cinematography keeps throwing our sense of direction and space for a loop and forcing us to catch back up to what's happening. This isn't helped by parts where the spatial relationships just seem to change between shots. Here we see the evil rabbit seemingly race directly up to the main character, and then launch a beam at him while jumping in a backwards arc. But when we cut to the beam hitting, it seems to come from farther away than where we expect the bunny to be positioned, and the bunny itself is no longer even on screen. Moreover, after the dirt cloud kicked up by the beam is shown traveling right to left across the screen, we then weirdly cut to a shot of the smoke coming to rest from a flat angle, and then to it continuing to travel from the original angle. I can only assume that at some point the intention was for this shot to end in the smoke dispersing, revealing the guy, but that after it was already animated, they decided to change it to the shot which was more consistent with the action that had just taken place, and then they left the other shot in anyways. Otherwise, this is just entirely too weird to comprehend. I will admit, though, that the teleport effect of the rabbit is actually kinda cool. Anyways, a big old bear comes along and eats the rabbit, and our dude is horrified at the realization that such a powerful enemy could be mere prey to this other, even stronger thing. As Bitch Boy runs away, his arm is severed by the bear, and he yelps out the most comical underreaction to the pain of having his arm severed imaginable. This was around the point where I started to realize that what I was watching was actually entertaining in its weird badness. But there's something more interesting about what I think they were going for here. You see, neither the original light novels nor their manga adaptation actually opens on this scene, if that wasn't obvious already. Each of those actually starts at the beginning of the story, establishing the characters and their situation at a more normal pace, leading up to the point where the main boy is dropped into this cave. By this point in either of those iterations, you would have had more than enough time to form a connection with this character. You'd know his suffering as well as his ambition. You'd even have witnessed how this very scene comes not long after his bold attempt to better himself as a person and to step into the role of a hero, right before getting betrayed by an unidentified comrade. All of this makes the fact that he loses his arm an effectively brutal moment. Up to that point, there's no reason to think that anything as intense as that was ever going to happen in this series, much less to the main character. And it's a pretty huge thing to lose at such an early point in the story. But it stings that much more to know that it only happened because he was stabbed in the back right at the moment when he tried to be a better help to the people around him. It sets the tone that we're going to be following an edgy anti-hero with a bone to pick against society. Pretty much in exactly the same way that S.H.I.E.L.D. Hero so effectively did the same thing, which Ari Fureta pretty blatantly just fucking copied. But we can talk about the unoriginality of the source material some other time. No matter how cliched the original story might be, at the very least it was functional. And for a lot of people, all that a story really needs to be effective is that level of functionality. If you aren't bothered by seeing something you've seen before, or even just straight up haven't seen it yet, and you aren't asking for deep characterization or theming from a story, then it can be enough just to empathize with what a character is going through and to witness them struggle with such a rapid descent into the pits of hell. But the Arifureta anime doesn't give you any of that. We don't even know what normal life is like in this world yet, to contrast that with the dark brutality of this cave. For all we know, the entire show is set underground. We have no idea who the hell this guy is, what he's been through, what he's trying to accomplish, or if we should give a shit. All we know is that he woke up in a scary cave, shit his pants, and got his arm cut off. In the original story, this was probably the most memorable and noteworthy moment of the first book, and so the anime writers must have thought they should put it front and center so that the effect of it could be felt immediately by the audience. But to think so is to 100% misunderstand what was impactful about the scene. Watching a random guy get his arm cut off is not noteworthy. This level of violence is commonplace in the opening scenes of action shows. It was precisely the fact that Arifureta wasn't particularly violent until that moment which made it shocking, and the anime gave that effectiveness up immediately, replacing it with hilariously goofy and underacted screaming as the guy spams some weird power that we have no context to understand to create absolutely hideous clone-stamped CGI rock structures and tunnel into the rocks. I don't know why he didn't do so earlier. So our guy passes out in the cave that he's dug due to blood loss, and the screen fades to black. This would seem like the right moment to cut to some backstory scenes and figure out how we ended up at this moment. But instead, we fade back in to our guy realizing that he's found himself in the presence of a holy crystal, a mythological stone created by the fossilization of mana over the course of— oh, now we're suddenly cutting to the backstory. Sure, go ahead. Here we are witness to the first of what will be many cheesy and obnoxious title cards placed directly in the middle of the screen and obscuring the scene behind them. Probably not the best font choice for a word that starts with either an H or an N, I honestly can't tell. They also never put a space between the number of days and the word days. Yes, I'm being absurdly pedantic, and yes, I took a typography class once and became an asshole forever. As we dive into our guy's studies, subtitle viewers better prepare to get BTFO by the terrible formatting of whatever site these sick nasty illegal rips came from. Parsing this block of text won't get you any closer though to what the fuck is going on in this show. We learn that our guy has the abilities of transmute and language comprehension. If we were reading the source material, we would be informed that these are very weak powers as compared to everyone else who has come to this world with powers. More on that later. But him simply stating that if he can't learn to fight, then he can't escape does not in any way indicate that the powers themselves are the problem and not simply his lack of mastery thereof. Moreover, the stills in the background are meant to show him sucking and getting trashed by the people he's training with, but it's so much to take in and raises so many questions that I certainly wasn't thinking about it my first time through. We haven't even established that this is an isekai yet, much less the unusual fact that in this story the main character was transported alongside several of his classmates. There is no reason to think that this training isn't being done with other people from this world, or even that our main character isn't a native to it. Hell, it's not even clear if the 3 images we see here are connected to one another. In the first one, everyone seems to be casting a spell. In the second, he seems to be having his weapon knocked away, and in the third, he's just getting bullied. If you look closely at the first image, the point is actually that everyone else has generated a magic circle and he hasn't. But even this contradicts the information on screen, in the dialogue, and displayed in the prior scene, that he does indeed have magical powers. Is it just that his don't cause a magic circle to appear? We don't even know what powers everyone else has to get a sense of comparison, nor understand who might have been knocking the weapon out of his hand in the other shot. And as soon as this brief montage is over, we cut right back into the cave. So much for figuring out how we got here? Well, thankfully we're only there for like a second before we cut to yet another location. You'll remember that the last one was 10 days ago, but all that was happening in that one was the guy doing research while remembering his training. So we have no idea when that actual training happened relative to when he was in the library, and it seems inconsequential to know how long ago that was. Well, this next part happened 7 days ago, and what might have been a decent establishing shot, which might give us a sense of what kind of kingdom this series is set in, gets completely ruined by the text covering it up for the whole duration of the shot. We next cut to an image so bright by comparison to the caves that it damn near seared my eyeballs out. I certainly wasn't expecting such poppy and cartoonish colors from this show, and it took a while for me to realize why these characters looked so incredibly different from the backgrounds and the scenes in the cave. The answer is colored outlines. Rather than outlining everyone with thin black lines, colors are chosen which either blend in completely or are barely different from the base colors. Combined with the very flatly shaded and bold color choices, this makes for a pretty striking visual aesthetic, and one which I'm ordinarily a huge fan of. In fact, if you just pause on this shot in the middle, some of these characters honestly look pretty great, and the aesthetic makes sense when they're the only things on screen. But where problems start to arise is when you impose these bright and poppy characters on the gritty and detailed backgrounds. It's the equivalent of putting Link from the Wind Waker into the world of Twilight Princess. Weird as shit. As is this huge group of people gormlessly standing still while a guy talks to them without facing them in a completely nondescript location which we do not see more than the floor of. Is this in the castle, the outskirts of town? Is it just outside the cave, which we cut to the interior of in the next shot? I have no idea, but we've shifted locations so many times now with so little sense of their relationship to one another or any reason for why anyone is there that around this point is where I started to check out on my initial viewing. At least in this next scene, we're finally treated to an ounce of characterization, though it's still impossible to tell who's important or what we're meant to care about or notice. It's clear now that the main guy is supposed to be totally useless and reliant on the others in his team to save him, but we don't know what any of these people's relationship to him is or why any of them are here. When the cute girl in the party stoops down to help the main boy, an edgy guy on the team kind of scoffs, but it's impossible to know what part he's scoffing at exactly. In the fray of battle, a shiny rock is dislodged, and we're told errantly that it's apparently commonly used as an engagement stone. Pretty girl thinks the stone is pretty, so edgy guy decides to go up and take it. Now, if you've really been straining your mind to pay attention, you can put together at this point that this guy has a thing for that girl, and that his earlier scoff was because he's upset that she's paying attention to our guy. You could just as easily have assumed at the time that he was simply scoffing at how weak the guy is, and since you don't know about his attraction to the girl until a moment later, you're not likely to think back on something as innocuous as a scoff. But you see, in the source material, you'd be more than well enough acquainted with all of these characters and their relationships by now. Even in the first chapter of the manga, which is truncated as compared to the light novel, the very first thing we learn about our main character is that he's a hardcore gamer who doesn't like coming to school because the hottest girl in class always tries to talk to him, and these other 3 kids are pissed off because they don't like that she's giving him attention instead of them. It is precisely these 5 who get isekai'd and are each given special powers, with our guy receiving the weakest one. Yes, literally exactly the same as what happens in Shield Hero. Now that you know all of this, you have every reason to suspect that this asshole guy has a bone to pick with the main dude and a reason to try and fuck him over. But with the information we've been given in the order and at the speed we've been given it, we probably haven't given this guy a single thought yet because we're still trying to understand what the flying fuck is going on. This is not made any easier by the fact that as soon as the guy touches the crystal, everyone is suddenly teleported to yet another location. And that's when shit gets hilarious. What do I even need to say about this? Like, when I was 4 years old in 1995, my favorite show on TV was Beast Wars. Beast Wars had better CG animation than this. I'm not sure if I laughed harder at the monster thing coming out of the ground with that ultra smooth head motion, or when this girl stabs a skeleton and it just fucking disappears. Or maybe when that same smooth head motion is used to dispel this guy's barrier. So our guy finally finds a way to make himself useful by holding the monster in place with his transmute ability. But the animators, I guess, didn't figure out how to portray this cheaply or convincingly enough, so we just keep cutting to rocks moving around and a bunch of dust. The first time I watched the scene, I had no fucking idea what was going on, given that the parameters of this power still hadn't been established. Like, it's called transmute, and nothing about that implies that it's just specifically weak earthbending, but that seems to be all it's used for, and since they never quite show exactly in what way all this rock moving and dust is preventing the forward advance of the monster, it just keeps getting more and more confusing and driving the tension lower and lower the longer it goes on for. So all the mages prepare their spells, and we see our guy running away. Then the earth crumbling becomes a visual transition back into the depths of the cave for some truly incomprehensible dialogue. Our guy just keeps shouting, "Die! I don't want to die! Die! I don't want to die!" Is he commanding himself to die? Is he mad at something or someone? What the fuck is going on here? He gets angrier and angrier, questioning who did this to him, even though at this point, we have no reason to believe that anyone did anything to him. It just seems like he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Of course, once again, this turns out to be a case in which the context that would allow us to understand what the fuck is going on only comes directly after the scene in which it would have been relevant. Turns out, some asshole deliberately aimed one of their energy beams at him, knocking him back into the pit. Blink though, and you'll completely miss the evidence, which is just this half second of a guy smirking amid the visual chaos. Compare that to the same moment in the manga, when it's unambiguously clear that some malicious figure was spotted by our guy as he gets hit. In the anime, it doesn't even seem like he saw this person smiling, but just assumed that someone must have targeted him because he did indeed get hit, when it just as easily could have been an accident. Why the previous scene was placed in between the two which explain it, I have no earthly idea. So we're halfway through the episode, and now we and our guy finally recollect our thoughts to get a grip on just exactly what led to his fall into the depths of the cave. And then we're treated to the most unintentionally hilarious moment I've seen in anime this year. This is where I became sure that I owed it to myself to continue watching this as a cringe comedy. And with that, we come to the realization that I've somehow talked about half an episode for half an hour. Jesus fucking Christ. We're gonna have to make this a two-parter. Come back tomorrow for the rest of my breakdown of this horrendous first episode. And if you want to help bring the series to fruition, become a patron. You'll get access to all kinds of cool rewards. Or maybe buy my t-shirt where I fight all these Kiritos. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.